and welcome to Cover Story. Today I have with me Ambassador Ajay Bisaria. He's an ex-envoy to Canada, Pakistan, Poland, and Lithuania. Someone who's really been there in all the conflict points, really, Ajay. So it's good to have you here at a time when the world is really at an unrest. You've also written a book on India-Pakistan, anger management, and also you're a distinguished fellow at the ORF. Good to have you here. But Ajay, first, can you make sense of what is happening around us, and how long do you expect this to continue? I know that's a difficult question, but what is happening?
Thanks, Priya. Thanks for having me. It's a troubled time, of course, and if we look to our west as India, we see not one but two theaters of conflict. There's the ongoing conflict between Afghanistan and Pakistan, which has been on for a while. It's been low intensity, but it's been ongoing. And then we are in day six of the Iran Israel US war. And that, of course, is the more worrying war from India's point of view because we have a lot of equities in the region. We have close to 10 million people floating around there. We also have a great deal of interest in oil and the Strait of Hormuz. When it closes down, it shuts 20% of seaborne oil trade. And, almost 50% of India's oil comes from that region and through that strait, as
Hmm.
also about 50% of LNG. So it's clearly a cause for great worry for India and great concern. About what is happening in the war, I think the state of play is that it's an asymmetric war to begin with in military terms. It's a dominant United States added to Israel. It's a huge power asymmetry, but Iran is not Venezuela. So it's not an in-out operation where you decapitate or extract the leader in a day and move out. It's a longer haul. And my guess would be that this war will be shorter than what Trump has proclaimed, that it will take him 4 to 5 weeks to finish the job. I think it'll probably end in 2 or 3 weeks, given the huge power asymmetry and the degrading of Iran's capacity. But the chances are it gets worse before it gets better.
Yeah, that was going to be my question because Iran is also not, sitting back. They are also lashing out at U.S. bases all over. Given that, where will the solution come? Because U.S. Donald Trump keeps saying we are not after a regime change, and there's this whole argument that regime change cannot happen from the air. It has to happen on the ground. The citizens from Iran are not really coming out and protesting the way they had thought that perhaps is what happened in Iraq. So, how do you see this panning out?
Yeah, the citizens can't come because there are bombs raining on their heads. So, in any case, the organic revolution that they expected is not happening immediately. But the bigger picture is that you have to decide whether the US and Israeli objectives have been consistent or have been stated, articulated clearly. Because if you recall, there was another war last year, the 12-day war. And there, the stated objective was to remove Iran's nuclear program, and the US stated that it had annihilated that program, and that was successful. So, in a sense, this was, from Israel's point of view, the end game of the process that started with the terrorism of Hamas in October 2023. And Israel said that they were facing a seven-front war, and they had degraded the capacities of all Iran's proxies, like Hamas, like Hezbollah, like this in Syria, the Houthis, and so on. But they had to strike finally at the head of the snake, which was Iran. And that process got over. But I think somehow in this year, the experience of Venezuela and the Iranian protests told the Americans and gave the illusion to both the Americans and the Israelis, perhaps, that Iran was ripe for a strike, and a quick decapitation strike would lead to the people taking over. Now,
That
clearly, that didn't happen immediately, and what they have is a longer conflict. I don't think the Gulf Arab states wanted it because they knew that the Iranians would strike at them. And while the Iranians say they are targeting, U.S. assets and U.S. bases, it's also economic infrastructure, which means that civilian infrastructure can be hit in the Gulf Arab states. So I think it's turned out to be a war that no one really wanted, but the Americans seem determined at this point to complete the job, which means it's not going to end very soon unless certain objectives are met.
So is US playing Israel's game or is Netanyahu playing Trump's game? I mean, who is calling the shots over here, really?
I think certainly it is US playing Israel's game because, it is Israel's kind of dream or Netanyahu's personal ambition for the last 40 years to be the one who could make that decision to end the Iranian regime and, reverse the 1979 revolution. So I think that is what he has managed to persuade Trump to do. And Trump has been game for various reasons, including the Venezuela example, which made it sound easy that you can do it from the skies, and also the domestic issues of the Epstein files and so on. It's a great diversion to have a war when you face some domestic issues at home. So I think for all those reasons, they have moved. It's tragic in a sense that there was also a process which was going on, which was a negotiation peace process with the Iranians, which was brokered by the Omani in Geneva, and that was abandoned because
But
the
was that a distraction? Do you think they were serious about it? Now it looks
I
like it was
think I
just a
think it was
distractions.
yeah, exactly. In retrospect, it was certainly a ruse to keep the Iranians distracted and then mount this. So the mission has creeped. So what has happened is that you have basically a situation where the mission of degrading Iran's nuclear capacity has moved to regime change, which is much harder. It's easy to do a decapitation strike or two or three, but
Hmm.
to be able to change the regime, as Keir Starmer, the UK PM, said, you need boots on the ground for that, which I don't think the US has the appetite for, at least at the moment, and nor will the MAGA base of Trump have the appetite for that because he came with the promise of ending the forever wars and being the man of peace, and this getting the US into a quagmire of a war in West Asia wouldn't be something his voters would appreciate.
And what about India's stand? There's been a lot of politics over India's silence over Iran, what has happened. The fact that the Prime Minister went to Israel 2 days before all this happened is also being taken into account by the opposition. How do you see India playing?
Well, India, again, like in the Russia-Ukraine war, has to be balanced in this approach, or at least to be seen to be balanced in publicly. Clearly, the war is not in India's interest. So, it is important to call it out and keep saying, asking for a cessation of hostilities or ceasefire. It is important to keep asking for, the US and Israel to get on to dialogue and diplomacy. But I think India should be and could be even more critical of the war, of using this pathway of war instead of trying dialogue and diplomacy to achieve those ends. And but India has to keep in mind its defense relationship with both Israel and the US, and at the same time, its sort of partnership with Iran to not lean too much one way or the other.
Because we're seeing the Ayatollah himself has not been very supportive of India. That is the explanation that people, especially from the BJP, are giving to us. That why should we, turn around and support him if because there has, it's not been a quid pro quo.
Exactly. So, there are multiple considerations at play here. There are interests in Iran, but certainly there are much greater equities in the broader West that India has. And India would have to balance those. We'll have to look at the world as it is rather than as it should be. Clearly, if you step back and look at it, it's this war is probably a strategic error with so many lives lost. The US and Israel should perhaps never have started it, used some other means. But now that we have a war in the region, we have to deal with that situation. And I think it's best done by balancing interests and calling for a rapid closure of the war. Even though even the West is conflicted on this, many countries are calling out the nature of the war, but also calling out the nature of the Iranian regime of the last 47 years, which has been a fairly brutal regime.
So, how do you see this impacting India's place in BRICS? Because we are seeing China and Russia have still not spoken out. They're really watching from the sidelines, unless I'm wrong. So, how does that work play out with what India is doing? Because people do say that we have picked a side by not reacting to Iran.
We have reacted in the sense we've called it out for the war that it is and called for an end to the war. But the situation also is that we are the chair of the BRICS. Now, this is Iran is also a BRICS country which has been attacked. The only countries which are making any noise about this are perhaps Russia and to a smaller extent China. And both these countries are also BRICS members. And what we are seeing also is that, this is playing as a larger US-China contestation because, almost all the Iranian oil was going to China. And if you see the rhetoric from the beginning of the year, it was we don't want China and Venezuela. We don't want China and Greenland. So the US is trying to make China exit its sphere of influence. And there's a broader US China contest also going on there, as well as the current problem. But, Iran stands isolated. There is no country in the world that is now willing to send any military resources, for instance, to Iran. And China, for instance, would only give it some kind of lip service support, both in terms of Russia and China. So it's a asymmetry in both in military and in diplomatic terms. There are very few countries standing by Iran right now.
And what signal does it send Russia vis-a-vis Ukraine? They went in to Iran. How can United States now, after Venezuela, after Iran, expect anything from Russia, any restraint?
Well, there's an irony there because you see what's also happening is that we are in the fourth year of the Ukraine war, which started
Right. My God.
in February. So it's already 4+ years. And
Hmm.
what's also happening is that the US is the peacemaker. It's where Trump is wearing his peacemaking hat with his 20-point
That war.
plan, and with Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner being the negotiators in Geneva, who were negotiating both the Iran peace as well as the Ukraine peace. So Russia has other fish to fry here. What is happening is that Russia would want the US, and it won't want to rock the boat of the US and jump into this situation because it also wants an end to the Ukraine war on its own terms. Even China is looking at a tactical accommodation with the US. Trump is scheduled to be in Beijing in April for what will be a tactical accommodation, not a strategic reset. And they also have an interest in, therefore, not opposing the US very strongly. So I think the US is banking on no other country opposing it in this action, getting it done in 4 or 5 weeks or earlier, and fulfilling Israel's dream of reversing the whole Iranian revolution and kind of degrading Iran's capacity.
Before we take a break, what do you make out of the optics regarding Dubai? No one expected that Iran would attack Dubai. It's always been seen as a sort of safe haven. Has that optic been shattered, or do you think this is just, one or two symbolic gestures and Dubai will recover from this?
I think Dubai will recover. It will be a shorter kind of threat. It is right now there is reason to panic in all the Gulf Arab states, whether you're in Qatar or Oman or anywhere else, because if the Iranian regime is a dying regime, is ending, they will throw everything they have and every capacity they have in the region. And therefore, it is a little fraught. But my feeling is that this will not last too long, and perhaps in a month from now, we would have forgotten the dangers they were.
I do hope you're right. I'm going to take a break and come back and talk to you about another theater closer to us and again in the area you know well, Pakistan and Afghanistan, and of course also about the Canadian Prime Minister's visit to India. So both areas of interest. We have you over here, but after a very quick short break. Hello and welcome back to a cover story conversation. I have with me Ambassador Ajay Bisaria. We were discussing, of course, the current conflict between Israel, US, and Iran, but also closer home, there is another theater going on, Ajay, Afghanistan and Pakistan. What is happening over there, and were you expecting this to blow up?
Again, that is somewhat unexpected. The kind of rhetoric and the kind of action, kinetic action we've seen. It's almost as if Pakistan has cut and paste from our copybook what we say about Pakistan to ascribe all that to Afghanistan, saying
Afghanistan.
that there are cross-border terrorists coming from Afghanistan and attacking Pakistan, and therefore it has no choice but to launch attacks. The Afghans saying, "No, you didn't hit our terrorist camps. You hit our civilians." And this kind of exchange is going on. The TTP and the Taliban, both the Afghan Taliban and the Pakistani Taliban, are not kind of giving up on this, and Pakistan is making all kinds of threats. So I think this is Pakistan's own playbook coming back to bite it. Because don't forget, way back in the 90s and earlier, Pakistan created the Taliban. And both the Afghan Taliban and the Pakistani Taliban are offsprings of that Taliban that was created. And Pakistan has allowed itself to become a country where the state or the army doesn't hold the monopoly on violence. They've created organizations like Jaish-e-Mohammed and Lashkar-e-Taiba, and on all sides, thinking that these are useful arms of the military. But these all come to bite you, as Hillary Clinton said, if you raise snakes in your backyard, they only won't only bite your neighbor. So I think that is the kind of problem Pakistan is facing, and it is a serious sort of threat, security threat, because this attack by the Afghans and the TTP and the Afghan Taliban is also being added to by the Baloch kind of problem that they face. So you see a coalescing of the whole Pashtun and the Baloch rebellions against the Pakistani state, and that becomes another problem for Pakistan.
And also the way they're treating Imran Khan, we've been seeing, yeah, must have been following that story. Is there any hope of any release for him, the way Pakistan is handling him?
Well, I think there is hope, and perhaps they are asking, the army is asking him to sort of concede and no, and do a deal like Nawaz Sharif had done earlier, go into exile or go into his home in Banigala if he says that he won't make too many statements. But I think the Pakistan army is worried, because if you look at the big picture, they have a
Hmm.
poly crisis. They have an economy that is in shambles. They have a situation where politically they have a crisis because they had a fake election in 2024 which Imran Khan would have won with a two-thirds majority. But they made through engineering, the Sharif brothers win it and install Shehbaz Sharif. So they have a political problem because of this. The people are not with them. The people are overwhelmingly with Imran Khan. The economy is not doing well. There's no investment coming in, and also the security problem. So all these are a huge headache for Asim Munir, who all he's managed to do is give himself two promotions after Op Sindoor. So, he made himself field marshal, he made himself the chief of defense forces, and he's consolidated his own position. But in the process, he's running Pakistan to the ground.
In the midst of all this doom and doom, some good news. I think the Canadian Prime Minister's visit here, Ajay, has seen a reset of relations between India and Canada, especially after your stint there. Remember, you were there when all the conflict was happening. You had to handle all that. How do you see it progressing, and what is your, reaction to the visit?
Well, it's been a very positive story. It's been a dramatic turnaround. Who would have imagined a year and a half ago when India and Canada were expelling their top diplomats? My successor, who was High Commissioner there, was expelled. Fortunately, I wasn't
Okay.
expelled from two countries,
So
so
yeah, I was going to ask you that. Okay, so good you were
yeah.
not there. That
Yeah, so it was our High Commissioner then who was expelled from Canada. There were accusations against India of all kinds of stuff, including what they called transnational repression, political interference, and much of that case was exaggerated. So I think Mark Carney has come as a Canadian PM who's pragmatic and who realized that his predecessor government had made a lot of errors on the India file. And, he also, it is partly the geopolitics that became more favorable because of the volatility of the US and of Trump. Carney
tariffs.
believed in what is being now called the Carney Doctrine, in a
Mm.
concert of middle powers, that the non-hegemonic powers, as he calls them, and middle powers like India, Australia, Japan, they should all come together and diversify their relationship. So as part of that reset, and it's more than a reset, it became move from reset to rebuild to renewal. So now it's a really sort of reliable strategic partnership that India and Canada have. There was excellent chemistry between Carney and Modi when he was here recently. And I think the move towards getting a free trade deal, a CEPA, a Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, by the end of the year, getting a very robust uranium supply deal, and taking forward cooperation in defense, in strategic energy, and so on. So I think this is a great deal of potential in the relationship. And the what Carney was essentially doing was cleaning up the mess that Trudeau had created. And that, I think, was the biggest contribution of his less than 1 year of being prime minister.
Yeah, and he did not include Punjab in his visit, which itself was very significant in terms of the optics. But
Absolutely. And the Canadians themselves are now, a lot of Canadian analysts are saying for once they now have a foreign policy where a national interest of Canada is trumping the geopolitics, or the politics of the diaspora. So a lot of times Canadian prime ministers in the past have been led by diaspora politics and therefore make severe mistakes on the India file. But this time it was a razor focus on the economy, and it was a laser focus, and focusing entirely on the issue of building an economic partnership that is lasting.
in terms of geopolitics, what are the meetings that you are looking at for markers? You spoke about the Trump Xi Jinping meeting, for instance. Any others that we should be looking at and seeing, in terms of driving the global narrative?
Well, there are lots of meetings coming up. There will be a meeting of Trump going to China is a significant event. And there will likely be two meetings between Trump and Xi. So what people are watching is he going to make it a G2, a collusion between the US and China in dividing their spheres of influence, or will it remain a contest? I think it will remain a contest. The other issue is whether the two wars get over, the
Yeah.
Ukraine war and the Board of Peace taking the West Asia to some kind of, some kind of solution. But also we have this year a number of other meetings. There's a G7 meeting that France will host in the middle of the year, where Modi should be meeting the G7 leaders like he did last year. There's a G20 meeting that the US will host at the end of the year. But before that, there is a BRICS meeting that India will host. And, so there's a lot of summit level diplomacy. And the million dollar question is whether the Quad summit will also be held. And I think it would be a good idea for India to have the BRICS summit and also the Quad summit, so that it takes us to balancing our equities in the West, along with this middle power, emerging power BRICS grouping.
Well, thank you so much, Ambassador Bisaria. As you said, very interesting times ahead, and I do hope there is peace at the end of this tunnel, as you have predicted, sooner than later. But we're going to watch this space. But thank you for now.
Thanks, Priya. Thanks for having me.